Hello. This week's topic is state legislatures. You should read the chapter on state legislatures before you attempt the question for the week. But I just wanted to give you a little background on this topic. As you know, the state legislature is the lawmaking body of a state. Now, each state has different names for their state legislature. In Michigan, it's just called the Michigan Legislature, but in some states, it's called the General Assembly. And there are other names that states use for their state legislative body. But ours is the Michigan Legislature. In 49 of the 50 states, the state legislature is bicameral, meaning that there are two houses. In Michigan, we have the Michigan House of Representatives and the Michigan Senate. There is one state, Nebraska, that has a unicameral legislature. It's a one-house legislative body, so there's no House and Senate. There's just the single house legislative chamber. So the legislation in Nebraska does not go, it just goes through the legislature and then it goes to the governor for approval. The legislature of Michigan is considered to be full-time, and you'll read about full-time versus part-time legislatures in the reading. A full-time legislature is one that meets throughout the year. They do take breaks or recesses at different points in the year, but they begin meeting in January and they conclude their year in December, and then they resume again a month after the December break. So they are meeting throughout the year. A full-time legislature considers bills, not just the budget, but other legislation throughout the year as things come up or as members want to introduce certain bills for consideration. Larger states, a lot of larger states have full-time legislatures, but not all. For example, Texas, which is one of the largest states, actually has a part-time legislature. In a part-time legislature, the members may only meet for a couple of months at the beginning of the year, right after the election, and they may not come back for another year or even 2 years again, unless the governor calls them into special session. Texas is a state, again, that has the part-time legislature. And in such situations, it can obviously shift a lot of influence to the governor, since the governor is not part-time. The governor is the governor all the time. He or she is in office, whereas the legislature in a state like Texas or in other states that have the part-time model is only in session for a couple of months every year, or maybe only a couple of months every other year. And the primary responsibility of any legislature is to pass the budget. And in the part-time states, that may be one of the few things they do, and they may look at some bills that the governor has proposed. But again, Michigan, we consider ours to be a full-time legislature. Certainly there are debates and discussions about whether we should go with a part-time legislature. There would be cost savings associated with that, since the members would not be making as much money and you wouldn't have to pay their staffs as much. But others would argue that in a state as diverse as Michigan, or as large and as important in terms of the responsibilities of state government, that you really need a full-time legislature that can not just approve the budgets, but check up on the executive branch to make sure it's following the budgets, and that the governor and the administration of government are doing what they should be doing. So there is some discussion of all that in the chapter on the legislature. One other thing I wanted to mention about state legislatures is that about 25 years ago, a number of states adopted term limits on the members of their state legislatures, and we did that here in Michigan. So we now have, it's actually a 3-term limit on members of the state house, 3 2-year terms in the state house, and 2 4-year terms in the state senate. And those are lifetime limits, meaning that at the end of the terms, the member is barred from serving again in the legislature. Our limits are pretty strict compared to other states. A lot of states have term limits, but they usually will allow the member to serve again in the legislature after they've sat out a couple of terms. But in Michigan's case, our legislators are permanently prohibited from running again once they've served their terms. And again, there are pros and cons to term limits. The advocates of term limits argue that it gives members, it freshens up the legislature so that people don't make a career of it, whereas others would argue that the legislature is so important that you need people who really understand what they're doing, and that 6 years in the state house or 8 years in the state senate, which is what we have here, is really not enough time to learn the job and to do it well. Another downside that people see to term limits is that it does shift a lot of influence to the governor and also to lobbyists and members of the bureaucracy who are not term limited. So I should mention the governor is term limited, but the people working in civil service jobs are not. So, at any rate, there are pluses and minuses, but the reality is we have what we have, and that's the case. Again, a couple other things. You have one person who represents you in the Michigan House, and you have one person who represents you in the Michigan Senate. There are 110 members of the Michigan House and 38 members of the Michigan Senate. They're elected by district, and they're roughly equal districts in terms of population. Currently, the Republicans have a majority in the state House and in the state Senate, but that could change in the next elections, which will take place in 2018. So if you have any questions about the topic of legislatures or how they work or term limits or the difference between full and part-time legislatures, just let me know. And I hope you have a great week. Thank you.